I'm now going to be showing you the interface and navigation object manipulations within Vue Infinite and xStream standalone. Even if you're running xStream within a host application, Max, Maya, XSI, Lightwave, Cinema 4D, it's still a good idea to learn how to use the standalone version. Because there are a lot of extra tools and some cool features that are available only within the standalone version. If we take a look at the viewports to start with, up at the top we can double click on the top of the viewport in order to make it full screen. So the bar for any of them, you can go ahead and double click to switch to the different viewports. You can also go up to the top and toggle the full screen. You can also set a keyboard shortcut to that. You'll note that under display I have mine set to F7 in order to toggle between it. You can use the number pad 1, 2, 3, and 0 to switch between top, side, front, and main camera view respectively. And then once one of those are selected, you can go full screen, and then you can switch between those as well. If you don't want to work in the main camera view, you can also switch over to the perspective view. So then you can view the scene in a different type of view, and that can be pretty helpful. All of the different object types can be found on the left, and we can also go up to the object menu up at the top and select create, and that'll allow you to create all the different objects. And then you can also add lights and perform some of the grouping operations and apply metaballs, hyperblobs, things like that to the objects. If you hover over certain items on the left here, you'll find that depending on whether or not you left click or right click on the mouse, you will get different types of objects being created. You can also click and hold down sort of a long click in order to activate the right click options. So in this case, if we take a look at the plant, if we were to right click, we could load a plant species and create an object in the scene. So if I was to left click and just hold it down for a second and let go, it'll also load a species. It's typically easier just to right click to open that up. So pay attention to some of these different object icons because they can have some hidden features. Typically, if you see a dot in the lower right hand corner, a small dot, then it's just left click and right click operations. If you see a little arrow, that means if you click and hold down or you right click, you can open up a menu with different objects within the group. Pretty much all objects have an edit panel for when you edit the object, with the exception to pretty much all of the Vue primitive objects. The alpha plane does have, or the billboard does have its own editing options. But other than that, the other ones for the primitives really don't. To edit an object, the easiest thing to do is just double click on the object. You can also double click on the object name within the world browser. You can also right click with the object selected, edit the object. You can also go up to the top and select the edit object or assign a keyboard shortcut. I've assigned mine to Z, which is actually different than the default. And I believe Control E is the default to edit an object. Now, to move around within the viewports, you can right click to kind of pan around and then use the zoom on the mouse to, or the scroll on the mouse to zoom in and out. I have my viewport set up to be independent. If you go to the File and Options, under Display Options and View Options, you'll see independent zooming and panning of views. What that'll do is allow you to move around within each of these viewports and not have it locked to a single scale or position. If you turn that off, then as you zoom into one viewport, it will refresh the other ones and manipulate those as well. Personally, I like having separate viewpoints, and you can always center to an object or frame an object. If we go up here to the top with this tree selected, I can right-click to frame the selected object, and we could just do that in all the views. There are a couple of different ways we can manipulate objects and change their vectors. And one method that you'll see within the viewport is being able to use the gizmos. If you go up to Display, Gizmo, if you turn Gizmo and show it on, it'll allow you to use this gizmo down here that we're seeing. Right now it's set to the position gizmo. You can also change the rotation and the scaling, and then you can also set up keyboard shortcuts for that. Now, in order to change the size of it, what you can do is use the number pad, the plus and minus keys, and that'll allow you to change the gizmo to a fixed size within the view. And the gizmo has different options for different axes, really depending on how you want to manipulate it. So if we take a look at the movement gizmo, we can constrain to an axis just by selecting that one specific axis. We can also constrain to two different axes by selecting the square in between. And if we take a look at switching over to the scale gizmo, we have basically the same thing, but for the scale. So we can constrain to different axes. If we just want to take this tree and make it fatter, we can grab this bottom bar here and just scale it on the X and the Y and leave the up and down Z axis where it's at. So then if we just wanted to scale it upward or down, we can just grab the Z axis and scale that up or down. If we go into rotation, there we have kind of a limit where we do have to select basically one of the axes or all of them. And so we could go through here and select the individual ones. Now I also want to note that there are different manipulation modes and coordinate modes for the gizmos. There's parent, local, global, and view. And I did just go ahead into the plant editor and divide the resolution of this plant to increase the refresh on my screen, since recording is taking a bit of my resources. So just went up to the top and divided it in half. So it reduced the polygon count by about half after clicking it a couple of times. So the fairly low-res preview in the display will render a lot higher, but it is more responsive. So if we take a look at the coordinates, the view coordinate system, and what we'll do is go ahead and add in just say a sphere to the scene. This is going to be relative to, in this case, the camera view. So the Z is going to move it towards the camera, and then we have up and down and left and right, all relative to the orientation of the camera in the current view. And you can see how as we move around, and I'm holding on Alt and left click to orbit, which is the same as the orbit within the main camera preview in the camera control center. or we could choose to rotate the camera side to side by using the rotate camera option next to the orbit. And I'm going to go ahead and just delete that sphere and go back to the tree here. And if we take a look at the global, actually the local system first here, we can see that the gizmo is rotated to match the object, so it will stay fixed to the local position or the object's actual orientation. If we go up to the top here, and in between the aspect tab we have and the animation tab is the numerics tab. Information for position, orientation, size, the twist function, which we'll take a look at in a minute, and then the pivot location, which is the point in which this object is rotating or being scaled from. If we switch over to the global mode, we'll find that the axes are always going to be fixed or start at that global coordinate, and we can rotate things around, manipulate them, but the gizmo itself will always revert back to the global after a transformation. The parent mode has to do with multiple objects. So if we go ahead and I just create a sphere, and I'm going to create a couple of duplicates, and you should be able to just hold down Alt and move it to create a couple of duplicates. So now I have this object selected first, and I'm going to go ahead and hold down Shift and select all of them within the world browser. If we go to the local mode, we'll be able to manipulate each of the individual objects from their location. And the parent mode should take whatever the first object was selected and move the gizmo. It looks like that didn't work. And it might be because of the way I selected. So if I go ahead and just select that bottom object first and then start using Control instead of Shift to click and select them, or I could select that sphere, hold down Shift, click and drag over those other objects. So the parent mode will always revert this back to the first object and make things relative to that first object that was selected. So as I rotate this with the parent mode, we can see everything is rotating around that first object that was selected. If we go to the local mode, and I start to undo that. And we should be able to rotate things from the individual objects. It doesn't look like that's working at the moment. Well, the reason that's not working is because of the master object mode. If we go to this third tab, which is the library tab, we have a master object. Now, because I duplicated this object over and over, and the object is it's basically the same, it's just copies, we have a master object that we can manipulate. So if we go to the master object addition mode, now we can change these objects and really just modify one of them, or one object, to manipulate them all. And when you're done, you can exit the isolation mode. If you do want to disconnect that connection to the master object, you can convert them to individual objects, remove the master object, and then if I go ahead and select these with the local mode, I should be able to manipulate them as I did with the master object. Well, looks like it's not quite working for that. And it might just be the way the rotation set up. If we take a look, and we'll see more examples of this a little bit later, something going to be a little more useful to understand. I want to take a look and just go ahead and add in a standard terrain, or a standard height field terrain. And we can take a look at some of the other manipulators besides just the gizmos. So if I turn off the gizmo, and you can go to gizmos and you can choose to turn it on or off, there are still additional options available, and what we can see is the gizmo helpers, the resize handles, rotation handles. So what we're seeing right now is the resize handle. So what we can do is modify the terrain an object this way. If we hold down Alt and grab the corner, it'll resize basically symmetrically. And if you go from the corners, depending on the setting that you have, because there is an option to resize around opposite corner. So if we turn that off, it's always going to be symmetrical unless we hold down Alt. So we kind of swap those around. We can also grab the middle dots and scale the individual axes that way. We can also use this rotation down here. And the one on the right is just going to fix it to the current viewport. And then the rotation icon next to that is going to be a full rotation, allowing every axis. If we go back and turn on the gizmos, then we also get some rotation handles on the edges. And I was having a little trouble selecting it. Sometimes that can happen. It wasn't letting me rotate around with that corner handle, and that is part of the, under gizmos, the rotation handles. So these are all the different handles that we're using right now. Whether the gizmo is really on or off. Sometimes looks like with the gizmos turned off it doesn't quite work. Now what I did was I just deselected the object and then reselected it. Also go out of the viewport in order to kind of refresh that to get those handles to work again. Another thing you can do sometimes if it doesn't work is to create another object, delete it, and then go back to the one you just selected. And that'll usually clear things up. So if we want to reset the orientation, we can just go in here in the numerics tab and set it to 0 all the way across. There's also an option that has to do with the movement, allowing you to move outside of the gizmo. So right now I have this turned on, which means I can select this terrain anywhere and move it. And I don't need to use the gizmo. I can just grab the terrain and position it where I want it to, be. Now if we turn that option off, then we have to be selecting one of the axes for the gizmos in order for that to work. So if you find yourself accidentally moving things a lot, then you might want to turn that option off. Now, when you're resizing objects that have rotation, it's a good idea to stay within the local mode for the scaling to avoid twisting from occurring. Especially with terrains if it's not intended, because it can make it difficult to work with in some areas. Mainly the terrain editor preview will not display any twisted objects. So we're going to take a look at what can happen with twisting, and what we're going to do is, now there's a couple of ways we could do this. We can go into the terrain and just use the twist options here. But I want to show you what can happen by modifying this within the viewport and having it twisted. So I'm going to take the local coordinate and just kind of move that around a little bit, resize it, or reorient it, and then switch to the global mode. So now that I'm using a global coordinate to scale this, it's going to modify quite a bit where those local axes are. And we're starting to get that twist showing. So if we go to the local now, what we're going to see is there's a big difference in the way that the axes are showing. They're skewed. Really, the twist is more of a skewing of the object towards one axis or another. And now we can still scale this kind of back. Go over, use the drop object command to drop it onto the ground. But if we go to open the terrain editor, we're not going to see any sort of twisting showing up in there. So that can make it difficult to edit the scene and work with it. And if we go to show the terrain within the scene, it's going to be way off typically, because it's going to change the orientation to try to match the normal non-twisted version, and it usually ends up being off. It does have its advantages, definitely. If we go in, I'm just going to create a new terrain. Actually, I'll create a procedural terrain, and we'll scale that up the local axis. Now if we go to the twist options within the numerics tab, and let's go ahead and do Z to Y, what we can do is twist the terrain and add, create overhangs or extruding rock this way. Now typically when you twist something, you get one chance to do it before you have to reorient the object. So I just did the Z to Y. If I go to do the Z to X, it's going to flip around the terrain and modify its orientation and reset kind of what we had before. So then we have to go back and reset the orientation. And once we do that, it usually ends up removing the twist. So you usually get about one chance to do it, whatever direction you want to go into. Which is why you can use the local and global coordinate to modify it further within the viewport and get a little more control, since you really only get about one option or one try to do it within the numerics without having to go back and reset everything. Transformations performed with gizmos can also be snapped to a defined resolution or size. I'm going to go ahead and delete the procedural terrain and just add in a cube. And this should be 6 meters by 6 meters by 6 meters, which is the default scale when you're working with an internal unit. Display unit of one view unit equals 1 meter. Now in File Options, which is how I got to this, File and Options, and under Units and Coordinates, you'll find that there is a snapping grid resolution. You can define the position snapping distance and the rotation degree, and whether or not you want it to be adaptive based on the zoom or how far away you are from the object, and that can depend on the different viewports you're in. So what we can do is select the axis. In this case we want to have a position snapping, and we can go ahead and just select the X axis, and then if we hold down Shift, it'll snap it. Now what it did was it kind of reset it to 0 because the grid position is relative to the pivot position, which happens to be in the center of this. So if I raise it up, it is going to be 3 meters above the ground. One thing you can do is if you go to the pivot, you can turn off the relative pivot, go to the Z, type in -3. And it looks like that may not work for this. There are other ways you can use dynamic links, but mostly it's because it's a view primitive. If it was a baked object, it'd be a little bit different. Whenever you manipulate a pivot position of a view primitive or a view object that's not just a mesh, the pivot's almost always a relative pivot. The original location is pretty much always stored, so overwriting that's not entirely possible without baking it. So now if we go to just the rotation, we can also hold down Shift, and then we're snapping to 15-degree movements. And if you look in the lower left of the screen, you'll find the coordinates showing up for the current transformation.